In front of hundreds of investors, Nolan Vance was called a garage mechanic with dreams of being an aerospace engineer. They laughed when he pulled the tarp off his hand-built helicopter, and Evelyn Hawthorne ordered security to remove him from the test facility. Nolan didn't argue. He set his keys on the table and walked away. That was the moment a convoy of military vehicles rolled to a stop outside the hangar. A brigadier general stepped out, looked at the Hawthorne leadership team, and asked, "Which one of you has the authority to sell Mr. Vance's helicopter to the Pentagon? Subscribe now, because the helicopter they laughed at is about to expose secrets powerful enough to bring the entire Hawthorne empire crashing down." The morning Hawthorne Aeronautics chose to announce the Valiant Hex to the world. The sky above Colorado Springs was the kind of deep, unbroken blue that made expensive things look even more expensive, and the test facility on the edge of the city had been polished until it gleamed like a promise. Investors arrived in black sedans, journalists carried press badges on lanyards, and somewhere behind a curtain of floodlights stood a helicopter that Sterling Hawthorne had spent 3 years and $300 million telling the world would change the future of aerial rescue. The guest list read like a directory of institutional power: defense contractors, congressional staffers, aviation journalists from publications that had never once printed a story that made Sterling look bad. It was, by every visible measure, the kind of day Hawthorne Aeronautics had been building toward for a decade. Nolan Vance arrived in a 10-year-old pickup truck, pulling a flatbed trailer with a helicopter strapped to it under a canvas tarp that was fraying at 2 of its corners. He had been sent an invitation that identified him as a maintenance contractor, not a designer, not an engineer, and certainly not someone with a claim on the intellectual territory of the event. The man at the reception desk looked at his work boots, then at the clipboard, then at Nolan's face, and directed him toward the service entrance on the north side of the building, the one marked with a laminated sign that said "Vendender, Access Only." Nolan didn't argue about the entrance. He pulled the truck around, backed the trailer in, and began uncoupling the straps on the tarp with the unhurried movements of a man who had done physical work his entire life and had made peace with the fact that most people never see the intelligence behind calloused hands. It did not take long for the crowd to notice him. A gentleman in a charcoal blazer approached with a set of car keys extended, having fully concluded that Nolan was the valet. A woman beside him stifled a laugh, and neither of them corrected the assumption when Nolan quietly declined and walked away. Blaine Hawthorne, who had the particular gift of knowing when a crowd was watching and how to use it, made his way over and asked, loud enough for a half-dozen journalists to hear, whether the garage Nolan worked out of also handled lawn equipment, because his estate had a mower that had been giving him trouble. The laughter that followed was light and social, the kind that doesn't quite commit to cruelty, but doesn't step back from it either. Sterling Hawthorne walked the length of the trailer, looked at the helicopter under the half-removed tarp, and said without lowering his voice that it looked like someone had raided a salvage yard and assembled the parts on a Sunday afternoon. The people around him smiled at this because Sterling Hawthorne had the gravity of someone accustomed to being agreed with. Evelyn Hawthorne stood 2 steps behind her father, and she watched Nolan's face when Sterling said it. She did not correct her father. She did not say anything at all. Nolan was directed to Park Haven H1 in the maintenance staging area at the rear of the facility, behind the main hangar, away from the presentation floor, where the Valiant Hex sat beneath a spotless dust cover waiting for its moment. It was only when Nolan passed the main display stage and glanced at the technical rendering on the presentation screen that he stopped walking. On the control interface diagram, nested in the lower left corner of the panel illustration, was a small triangular symbol with a horizontal dash beneath it. It was a notation he had invented himself years ago as a shorthand for the sensor fallback state in a flight stability system. He had never seen it in anyone else's documentation. He was looking at it now on a screen that bore the Hawthorne corporate logo. Nolan Vance had not always been a man with grease on his hands and a fraying trailer. A decade before the morning of the Valiant Tech's announcement, he had been Hawthorne Aeronautics' chief flight stability engineer, the kind of technical mind that companies like Hawthorne built their serious reputations on while publicly celebrating the executives who wore the reputations like suits. He had spent 4 years developing an algorithm that allowed a helicopter's control systems to maintain coherent flight even when sensor inputs became contradictory. In turbulence, in icing conditions, in the controlled chaos of a mountain rescue approach where altimeters and GPS units often disagreed with each other. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of engineering that saved lives in situations no one wanted to think about until they were in one. Evelyn Hawthorne, who was running the project at the time, had understood what Nolan was building and had treated him accordingly, with the specific respect that technically competent people offer each other in the absence of corporate theater. The trouble began when Sterling Hawthorne decided the timeline was more important than the testing schedule, and the timeline was always more important than the testing schedule. Whenever a contract with a long string of zeros attached to it was waiting on the other side, Nolan refused to sign the certification that would have moved the system into production because the algorithm had not been validated in high-altitude crosswind conditions, and Nolan was the kind of man who understood that the gap between probably works and confirmed works was measured in human lives. He had said so in writing, twice, in the language of formal engineering review, in documents that Hawthorne had accepted into its records and quietly filed in a folder no one was encouraged to open. Blaine, who was 25 at the time and already fluent in the language of cutting corners without being the one who got cut, quietly arranged to have a partially completed version of the software loaded onto the test aircraft. The flight that followed was alarming. The helicopter pitched and yawed in a pattern that no competent test pilot would have described as stable. But Reed Lawson, who was as skilled as anyone who had ever flown for Hawthorne, managed to bring it down safely, in part because Nolan, watching from the control room, talked him through switching to the manual override that Nolan had built into the system precisely for moments like that one. Sterling's response was not gratitude. It was a revised incident report that identified the unstable flight as the result of a flawed algorithm submitted by Nolan Vance, and a meeting in which Nolan was offered the choice between a quiet resignation and a formal termination with a record that would follow him through every background check in the aerospace industry. At the same time, Nolan's wife had been in the final months of a battle she was going to lose, and he had a 17-year-old daughter at home who needed someone to be there in the evening. He accepted the resignation and walked out of Hawthorne Aeronautics with nothing that bore his name. Evelyn had been given the opportunity to call for an independent investigation. She had looked at the projected cost to the company's stock price, looked at the timeline for the production contract, and decided that the family's version of events was close enough to the truth to let stand. Nolan never blamed her for being human, but he never forgot what she had chosen. In the years that followed, he opened a small repair shop called Vance Aviation and Motor Repair, and he fixed aircraft engines and truck engines and whatever came through the door. And he kept Tessa fed and enrolled in school, and in the hours after she went to sleep he worked in the back of the garage on a design that no one at Hawthorne had ever asked him to stop thinking about. The helicopter he built from salvaged airframe components and entirely original control architecture was registered under a legal trust he had established with his attorney, Marla Keene, and the patents that emerged from that work were filed under the name Vance Flight Trust. None of it belonged to Hawthorne. He had been very careful about that. What Sterling Hawthorne did not understand, what he perhaps had never been forced to understand, was that an idea can leave a building without transferring ownership to the building. 3 months before the Valiant X announcement, a blizzard had trapped a geological survey team on a ridge above 11,000 feet. The helicopters with enough power to reach that altitude could not maneuver safely in the terrain. Nolan flew Haven H-1 to the site 5 times over 6 hours, brought all 6 members of the team down, and landed in spaces that other aircraft would not have attempted. The flight data from those missions was forwarded by the Regional Rescue Authority to a Defense Department evaluation program that was quietly looking for aircraft capable of operating in exactly those conditions. Marla Keene called Nolan the morning of the Hawthorne showcase and said, "They just filed a declaration claiming Haven is a derivative work of Hawthorne's proprietary systems." Sterling did not ask Nolan to the VIP room as a courtesy. He asked him there because he believed, with the confidence of a man who had converted every previous obstacle into a transaction, that a person who repaired motorcycles for a living would accept $2 million to make a complicated situation uncomplicated. The room held Evelyn, Blaine, 3 corporate attorneys, and 4 board members, all of them arranged around a table that probably cost more than Nolan's truck. The contract was already printed and sitting at the center of the table when Nolan walked in, and Sterling gestured at it with the particular grace of someone presenting a gift they expect to be received with gratitude. The terms were not subtle. Nolan would transfer all patents held under Vance Flight Trust to Hawthorne Aeronautics. He would sign a statement confirming that Haven H-1 had been developed using methodologies originated within Hawthorne's research programs. He would never publicly reference the incident from 10 years prior, and he would accept a position as a maintenance consultant, reporting to Blaine with a title that Blaine phrased as Senior Technical Advisor, but which carried no authority over any design decisions whatsoever. The $2 million was framed by Sterling as an act of generosity toward someone who, in Sterling's estimation, had run out of other options. Blaine added that the company would provide Nolan with a proper uniform and ensure his name appeared in the employee directory, under a department that handled equipment upkeep. Nolan read the contract. He turned it over to look at the back page. He set it down. When Evelyn suggested that he consider what the money could mean for Tessa's future, he understood 2 things simultaneously: that she meant it as a practical observation, and that Hawthorne's people had been researching his daughter's financial circumstances carefully enough to know that offering for her name as a pressure point would land. He looked at Evelyn for a moment before he spoke, and what he asked her was whether she had reviewed the rescue flight data from the blizzard 3 months ago. She said that Blaine had indicated Haven had not met standard certification benchmarks, and she had deferred to his assessment. Nolan said he would like an independent flight evaluation before any contract was signed. Sterling said that no one in any serious government capacity was going to spend time on a helicopter assembled in someone's backyard. Nolan looked at Sterling and said that a man willing to pay $2 million for something he publicly described as junk had revealed more about his own fear than any technical document could. Blaine's composure broke cleanly at that line, and he called for security. Nolan stood, and before he walked out of the room he set his key to the Haven H-1 on the table. He kept the encrypted start card in his pocket. He said clearly, for the benefit of the attorneys present, that no one in that building had his authorization to attempt to fly the aircraft. He was being walked through the main hangar by a security guard when the first military vehicle turned off the access road. Brigadier General Caroline Whitaker stepped out of the lead vehicle with the bearing of someone who had long since stopped worrying about what rooms she was expected to wait outside of. Dr. Malcolm Reeves followed with a tablet and a hard case, and behind them came a 6-person evaluation team whose uniforms indicated they had traveled from the Pentagon's Logistics and Acquisition Division. Sterling Hawthorne had been expecting someone from the Defense Department, but he had expected someone who came to watch the Valiant X demonstrate its capabilities and write a favorable summary. He moved toward the general with his hand extended and began introducing Blaine as the lead architect of Hawthorne's rescue aviation program. Caroline cut the introduction off precisely at the point where Sterling drew breath, and she asked where she could find Nolan Vance. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room full of people realizing simultaneously that they had misread the situation entirely. Blaine said that Nolan was a maintenance contractor who handled peripheral equipment and that he was somewhere in the service area. Malcolm opened his tablet and displayed a data summary from the Blizzard rescue operation. Altitude profile, wind shear measurements, landing zone dimensions, flight time per extraction, mechanical status at mission completion. Haven H-1 had operated in conditions that grounded every other aircraft available to the rescue authority that day. It had done so without a maintenance failure, without a sensor cascade, and without a second pilot. The data was not a story, it was a log. Caroline said that the Defense Department had been authorized to initiate an emergency evaluation for an aircraft suitable for rescue, medical evacuation, and disaster response operations in high-difficulty terrain. She said Haven H-1 matched the operational profile more closely than any aircraft currently in the evaluation pool. Sterling announced that Hawthorne Aeronautics held rights to the aircraft. Nolan, who had been brought back when Caroline asked for the owner of the helicopter, said with the same calm he had maintained since arriving that morning that those rights were not Hawthorne's to hold. Marla Keene had already transmitted the Vance Flight Trust registration and patent filings to the evaluation team's legal contact before the convoy reached the facility. Hawthorne's attorneys produced an internal development memorandum. It carried no signature from Nolan Vance, because no version of such a document had ever been presented to him for signature. Malcolm, examining both sets of documentation on his tablet, noted that several design diagrams in the Valiant X technical package contained illustrations of control architectures that appeared in Nolan's earlier filings, without attribution and without a licensing reference. Caroline said that all commercial discussions with Hawthorne Aeronautics regarding the evaluation program would be suspended until provenance was established. The journalists who had spent the morning filming Nolan's work pants now had their cameras aimed at Sterling's face. Blaine said that Nolan had manufactured a dramatic rescue scenario to mislead federal evaluators. Caroline said that 6 people had been extracted from an active storm environment, that the regional rescue coordinator had filed a full incident report, and that the evaluation team had already spoken with 4 of the 6 survivors. Reed Lawson, who had been contacted by the evaluation team 3 weeks prior on the basis of his test flight history, stepped forward and said there was something he needed to say before he got into any aircraft bearing the Hawthorne name. What Reed Lawson said, standing in a facility he had worked in for 20 years, was not a short statement. He had been carrying it a long time, and it did not come out smoothly. He said that on the day of the test flight that ended Nolan's career at Hawthorne, the software loaded onto the aircraft had not been the version Nolan had certified for flight. Blaine had authorized the installation of a developmental build that removed several of the conditional overrides Nolan had considered essential, on the grounds that the overrides added half a second of response lag that looked bad on a specification sheet. The aircraft had behaved exactly as Nolan had warned it would behave in conditions the incomplete version had not been tested for. And when the helicopter began to move in ways that Reed could not stabilize through normal inputs, it was Nolan's voice from the control room, calm, and specific, that told him exactly which manual sequence would bring the aircraft back under control. Reed said the post-flight report he had signed did not match what had happened. He said he had been told by Sterling Hawthorne, in a room with one other witness who had since left the company, that his career in test aviation was over if he filed a contradictory account. He said he had kept a copy of the original telemetry because he was a test pilot and deleting flight data violated something in him that Sterling's threat had not been able to reach. He said he had not been brave enough to do anything with it until the morning a Defense Department investigator called him and said they were trying to understand what had actually occurred at Hawthorne 10 years ago. Evelyn's face changed as Reed spoke. Not dramatically, she was too practiced for that, but in the specific way that faces change when a thing they have chosen not to examine for years is suddenly placed in front of them in full light. She had built her authority at Hawthorne on the premise that she was a rigorous executive, that she asked hard questions, that she did not allow sentiment to overrule evidence. She had told herself the incident report had been reviewed at multiple levels, and that her confidence in the family's account had been reasonable. Listening to Reed, she understood that she had not asked the hard questions because asking them would have required her to distrust the people who had given her the job and the name that opened every door she had ever walked through. She said, quietly, that she had signed an incident review based on the report. Nolan said he remembered. He said he had asked her, before that report was finalized, to allow an independent technical review of the telemetry. She said she remembered that too. Malcolm had already compared Reed's preserved data against the official Hawthorne incident file, and the number differences were not rounding errors or transcription mistakes. They were systematic alterations, consistently distributed across the moments when the flight had been most unstable. The comparison also revealed something else: the control logic in the current Valiant X system. The version Hawthorne was preparing to demonstrate to investors and government observers that same afternoon used a sensor fallback architecture that bore a structural resemblance to the approach Nolan had been developing before his forced departure. The version in Valiant X was cruder in several respects, missing redundancies that Nolan had considered non-negotiable, but the underlying logic was recognizable. Evelyn used her authority as CEO to halt the Valiant X demonstration flight. Sterling told her that hundreds of investors were waiting. She said that a CEO who maintained her position by concealing safety data was not a CEO the company could afford to keep. Sterling said she was going to lose everything. She said that was her decision to make. Blaine looked at the room and understood that the shape of the day had changed in a way he had not prepared for. Caroline Whitaker did not permit Blaine to reframe the afternoon as a competition. What she constructed instead was a controlled evaluation exercise, formatted on the standard criteria her office used for any rescue aircraft assessment: crosswind takeoff, approach to a restricted landing zone of the kind encountered in mountain terrain, transport of a standardized medical equipment load, and completion of the full sequence with one secondary sensor system disabled to simulate partial instrumentation failure. Both aircraft were inspected by the evaluation team's technicians before any flight was authorized. Neither crew was told the specific order of the assessment elements in advance. Reed Lawson flew Haven H-1. A Hawthorne test pilot with 20 years of experience flew the Valiant X. Nolan did not attempt to fly the assessment himself. He stood beside Malcolm at the observation station, answered technical questions, and said nothing about the Valiant X's performance that could be interpreted as commentary on the outcome. The Valiant X was faster in the open phase of the exercise by a margin that Blaine communicated to the assembled investors with visible satisfaction. The helicopter was powerful, it was polished, and its pilot was skilled. When the assessment moved into the restricted landing zone segment, Both aircraft performed within acceptable parameters. The gap appeared in the simulated sensor failure phase. The Valiant attacks conflict resolution logic, which had been simplified, Malcolm would later note, by removing a redundancy layer that reduced the aircraft's maximum payload by 40 pounds, began issuing contradictory instructions to the pilot when the disabled sensor created inconsistent altitude readings. The system could not prioritize between competing inputs. The Hawthorne pilot, following protocol, called off the approach and returned to base. It was the correct decision. It was also a failure to complete the mission. Haven H-1 detected the sensor inconsistency, defaulted to its backup data hierarchy without pilot intervention, issued a single advisory alert, and continued the approach. Reed completed the equipment placement in the designated zone, held the hover, and returned to the staging area. The aircraft had not won because it was faster. It had won because when the conditions became the conditions that actually mattered, it kept flying. Malcolm's subsequent review of the Valiant X engineering logs confirmed that the removed redundancy layer had been part of a cost reduction decision made 14 months prior, a decision made against the written objection of 2 engineers whose names were in the documentation. The logic that the redundancy replaced was traceable through version history to a design framework that had originated with Nolan Vance. Sterling accused Nolan of having prior knowledge of the assessment criteria. Caroline said the scenario was derived directly from logged rescue incidents in federal databases and that no aircraft design team had been given advance access to the parameters. Haven H-1 had not been optimized for the evaluation. It had been built for exactly those conditions. The engineers in the observation area began applauding before the rotor had stopped turning. Nolan walked directly to the aircraft and crouched beside the landing gear to examine the skid contact surfaces, looking for stress markers, while Reed was still unstrapping from the cockpit. Caroline formally requested Nolan's participation in the next evaluation phase and asked him to submit a proposal for the fabrication of a small evaluation fleet. Hawthorne was no longer the only name in the program. Before Nolan could open the acknowledgement document, a Hawthorne security officer approached and said that a restricted component belonging to the Valiant X program had been found in Nolan's toolcase. Blaine's accusation was immediate and specific. He said the component was classified within the Valiant X development program, that Nolan had taken it, and that accepting a government evaluation proposal from someone who had just committed an equipment theft was a matter of federal security concern. Sterling had already relayed the allegation to a press contact. The phrase "garage mechanic steals proprietary hardware" was moving through the room before the component had been examined. Nolan did not resist the inspection of his toolcase. He asked, in the hearing of the evaluation team's legal officer, that the serial number on the component be read aloud and cross-referenced against Hawthorne's official production records. Malcolm ran the number through the tablet linked to the documentation Hawthorne had submitted to the evaluation program. The number did not appear in Hawthorne's certified component registry. It did not appear in their development logs. The physical characteristics of the piece, its machining marks, its connector format, the material composition visible at a broken edge, indicated it had been fabricated separately from Hawthorne's standard production process. The facility's security camera system covered the parking area where Nolan's truck had been staged. The footage showed a Hawthorne program assistant approaching the driver's side of the truck during the flight evaluation window, when the entire crowd had been watching the aircraft. The assistant, when brought into the conversation, initially said he had been checking whether the vehicle was obstructing an access lane. When the evaluation team's investigator noted that the camera angle showed him opening the truck's bed cover and placing an object inside the tool case that was visible in the frame, the assistant's account changed. He said Blaine Hawthorne had instructed him to place the component before the assessment concluded and to report its presence to security afterward. He said he had been told it would end Nolan's involvement with the program and resolve the situation cleanly. Blaine said the assistant had acted independently out of misguided loyalty. Nolan produced his phone and showed the evaluation team's investigator a digital timestamp log. The location data on Blaine's device, obtained under the authority of the ongoing preliminary investigation, showed a message sent to the assistant's number at 10:47 that morning. Marla Keene, reviewing the component with a magnifying glass she kept in her briefcase for exactly the kinds of situations she had learned to expect from the Hawthorne family, identified a circuit element inside the housing that used a proprietary encoding approach documented in one of Nolan's earlier patent filings. The component Blaine had placed as evidence of Nolan's theft was itself built on Nolan's intellectual property. Caroline directed her team to seal the Valiant X project servers pending a full investigation. Sterling made a phone call to a congressional office he had funded generously for 11 years. The call was not returned. The board of Hawthorne Aeronautics convened by video within 40 minutes. Evelyn was told, clearly and in terms she could not misunderstand, that the family expected her to manage the situation in a way that protected Sterling and Blaine from personal liability, which in practice meant denying, delaying, and redirecting until the investigation lost momentum. She went to her email archive instead. She had kept everything, including a message from Sterling dated the week after Nolan's departure, in which Sterling directed the incident review team to ensure that the root cause finding aligned with the company's insurance position. She also found a document chain in which Blaine had used her digital signature, copied from a previous authorization she had signed for a different purpose, to submit Hawthorne's ownership claim on Haven H1 to the evaluation program. She had not signed that document. She had not known it existed. She forwarded the full archive to the investigation. Sterling Hawthorne arrived at Vance Aviation and Motor Repair after 9 in the evening, which was the hour a man drives to a location he considers beneath him because no other option is available. He came with Evelyn and Blaine, 2 board members, and a contract that had no numbers printed on it, which he explained was because he wanted Nolan to name his price. The garage was lit by 2 overhead fluorescents, one of which flickered occasionally, and Nolan was working on an engine block when they walked in. He wiped his hands on a shop towel and waited for Sterling to begin. The offer was comprehensive. $100 million, paid through a structure Marla had not yet reviewed, a vice president title with a technical mandate, a manufacturing facility that would carry Nolan's name on the exterior signage. In exchange, Nolan would convey Haven H1 and all related patents to Hawthorne Aeronautics, would withdraw from the government evaluation program as an independent party, and would issue no further public statements regarding the history of the company's flight safety record. Sterling presented this as the kind of resolution that allowed everyone to move forward. He said the word legacy twice. Nolan said no. Sterling said that if Hawthorne Aeronautics collapsed, the 1,700 people who worked in the company's manufacturing division would lose their employment, and that Nolan would be responsible for that. Nolan said the people Sterling was describing were currently working on aircraft whose safety architecture had been falsified, and that the people most responsible for placing them in that position were in the room with him at that moment. Blaine offered an apology that explained itself as a response to competitive pressure and time constraints, which was not an apology for having done anything wrong, only for the circumstances that had made him do it. Nolan said that if Blaine wanted to demonstrate genuine accountability, he could begin by apologizing to the program assistant, who had been used as a disposable instrument, and to Reed Lawson, who had carried a false official record for a decade. Blaine did not do this. Evelyn stepped in front of her father. She said she was not there to negotiate a deal that protected the family. She said Hawthorne would surrender the full documentation archive to the investigation, regardless of what it cost the family's board control. She did not ask Nolan to protect the company. She asked him to consider the safety of the pilots currently flying Hawthorne aircraft and the workers whose livelihood was not their fault. The distinction mattered. Sterling's offer had been framed as a favor to Nolan's moral sense. Evelyn's request acknowledged that the consequences of what her family had done were real and already distributed across people who had not chosen to be involved. Sterling, finally, said what he had not been willing to say inside the facility, that the operational Hawthorne fleet needed Nolan's safety patches applied, or the company faced a grounding order that would end the program entirely. Nolan said he would provide the safety update licensing. He would not transfer ownership. He would not supply the updates as a transaction point in any commercial agreement. He would provide them because pilots were flying the aircraft. He said there were 4 conditions. The first condition was a matter of record. Hawthorne Aeronautics would formally retract the incident report that had concluded Nolan was responsible for the test flight instability a decade prior. The retraction would be public and would acknowledge that the software installed on the test aircraft had not been the version Nolan certified, that the incident had occurred as a result of unauthorized alterations made to his work, and that the corrective action taken by Nolan during the flight had contributed to the safe outcome. The retraction would also include an apology to Reed Lawson and a formal acknowledgement of the engineers who had filed objections at various points and been overruled or pressured into silence. The second condition concerned Blaine. He would be removed from every position within the company. The falsified data, the fabricated evidence, and the digital record of the instructions sent to the program assistant would be transferred to the relevant investigative authorities without redaction. The company would not allocate legal resources to his personal defense. Employees who had followed Blaine's directives under coercion and who chose to cooperate with investigators would receive employment protection. The third condition was for the workers Sterling had used as leverage. No mass reductions in the manufacturing workforce would be implemented as a cost recovery mechanism for the damages the company had incurred. Sterling would use personal equity to guarantee the payroll during the investigation period. An independent safety board would be established with representation from engineers, pilots, and rank-and-file employees, not from the family, not from the board, and not from anyone whose compensation was tied to quarterly earnings targets. Any fleet modification required by the safety update process would be completed before the corresponding aircraft returned to operational service. The fourth condition was about Haven itself. Haven H-1 would remain the property of Vance Flight Trust. It would not be sold, licensed exclusively, or incorporated into a commercial product line that priced it out of the rescue operations it had been designed to serve. Any manufacturing partnership with Hawthorne would be governed by an agreement that specified production standards, safety audit requirements, and pricing constraints tied to the program's humanitarian mission. All technical modifications to Haven's design would require review by an independent panel before implementation. Hawthorne could be a partner in making the aircraft. Hawthorne could not be its owner. Sterling objected to every point in sequence, and in the order a man objects who still believes volume is a form of logic. The board members in the room did not support him. They supported the conditions, individually and collectively, because the alternative was a federal investigation that halted their business entirely and a liability exposure that made $100 million look like a line item. Evelyn cast the deciding vote to remove Sterling from the chairman position with the composure of someone who had rehearsed the moment in private for a long time and was now simply completing the action. Sterling looked at his daughter for a moment with an expression that mixed disbelief and something older, something that knew she was right, and then he left the garage without saying anything further. Blaine was removed from the program within 48 hours, quietly, without the theatrical confrontation he had been building toward throughout the day. Nolan signed the safety update license at a folding table in his garage. He did not accept a title. He did not accept a vehicle. He asked for a week before anyone contacted him about the next phase of the evaluation program. 6 months after the morning Sterling Hawthorne had stood in a 10-year-old garage and discovered that some things cannot be purchased, the federal investigation delivered its findings. Sterling lost board control in the settlement that followed. Blaine faced formal charges related to evidence tampering and obstruction. Evelyn retained a diminished operational role under the supervision of an independent director and fulfilled her stated commitment by testifying completely and without qualification. Hawthorne Aeronautics did not collapse. The 1,700 workers kept their jobs. The company entered a manufacturing partnership for Haven H-1 components under terms that gave it no design authority, no ownership rights, and no ability to modify the aircraft's safety architecture without independent review. Nolan expanded the garage into an organization he named Vance Rescue Aviation. He hired engineers whose names had appeared in Hawthorne's internal objection filings and whose careers had been managed into quiet corners for years afterward. He hired Reed Lawson as chief test pilot. He hired 2 mechanics who had no engineering degrees and extensive knowledge of how aircraft actually behaved in the field. The team was small, deliberate, and not interested in moving faster than the work required. Haven H-1 passed the first formal evaluation phase. The Defense Department signed a contract for 6 evaluation aircraft. Not a billion-dollar production fleet. Not a transformation of Nolan's life into a version of the life Sterling Hawthorne had offered him, but a specific, bounded, honest commitment to determine whether the aircraft could do what it had already demonstrated it could do. Tessa Vance attended the handover of the first evaluation prototype. She was 19 years old and studying mechanical engineering at a community college 40 minutes from the garage, and she stood beside her father with the expression of someone who has grown up understanding that the most important work often happens in rooms no one photographs. Her name was not on the aircraft. Nolan's name was not prominently on the aircraft either. The fuselage carried the names of the full engineering team in the same font size, in the same location, arranged alphabetically. A reporter asked Nolan how it felt to have gone from a garage mechanic to a defense contractor. Nolan said he had not stopped being a garage mechanic. He said that knowing how to fix a machine was not something a person should be ashamed of, and that the only genuinely shameful thing he had witnessed in the aerospace industry was watching men with clean suits and large offices accept credit for work done by people whose names they had removed from the documentation. Evelyn came to the handover without a staff member beside her. She brought the corrected official incident report, signed by the investigation and bearing a formal retraction under the Hawthorne corporate seal. She handed it to Nolan without a speech. He accepted it and said that trust was not a document and would take longer. She said she knew that and had not come expecting anything faster. 2 people who had once worked together well began, in the most careful possible terms, to remember what that had felt like. Haven H-1 lifted from the concrete pad behind the garage on a morning when the Colorado sky was the same deep, unbroken blue it had been the day the Hawthorne showcase had tried to bury it. The people who had laughed at the fraying canvas tarp stood at a distance and watched. On the fuselage, below the team roster, was a single line in plain block letters, designed to bring people home. 1 year after the garage visit that Sterling Hawthorne would never speak of publicly, Haven H-1 completed its first operational mission. extracting medical personnel and supplies from a flood-cut valley where road access had been severed for 11 days. The aircraft carried no weapons. It carried a medic, 2 emergency technicians, and enough insulin to last the isolated community another week. When it came back, Nolan inspected every accessible fastener by hand, the way he had done after every flight since the prototype first left the ground, because knowing what you built did not mean trusting it without verification. Tessa asked her father one evening whether he still felt the anger he must have felt on the day people with cameras and laughter had pointed at his work clothes and decided they knew everything worth knowing about him. Nolan looked at Haven where it sat under the garage lights, quiet and functional, and exactly what it had always been, and said that a person who knows what they have made does not need to be angry at the judgment of people who only looked at the surface. They called him a garage mechanic to diminish him. They used the word like it explained why he didn't belong in the same room as their ambitions. But the Pentagon had not come to him in spite of his garage. They had come to him because of what the garage had produced, a machine that could be fixed with common tools, trusted in the worst conditions, and counted on to bring people home. They laughed because Nolan built his helicopter in a garage, until the most powerful people in the room discovered that the garage had built something the entire Hawthorne Empire, with all its money and all its influence and all its polished concrete floors, had never been able to make.
Wow. Just a regular enemy? Yeah. Dude, it was hard. The easiest part of the game was the easiest game after Super Mario. What, you're saying this is easy? So Super Mario is the easiest and this is second? Let's go back. Heal up, baby. Let's get it. Like that shit. Like that shit.